It was supposed to be a quiet family dinner, the kind that was supposed to feel warm and inviting, but it tasted like humiliation instead. My father's words cut through the clinking of silverware. "She's too poor for family Christmas," he said, not even lowering his voice. My mother kept chewing. My brother Evan smirked, his fiancée Alyssa trying and failing to hide her grin. I stared at my plate, pretending to slice through the baked apple dessert I couldn't swallow. In that moment, something in me cracked, not loud but deep. And that's the thing about being underestimated. It doesn't break you all at once. It builds a fire. Dinner was held at my parents' lake house in Oregon, the same house where I once learned to ride my bike and later learned how small I was allowed to dream. Everything gleamed, the lights, the laughter, even the way Alyssa's diamond caught the chandelier glow. I came straight from work, still in my worn blazer, feeling acutely aware of its lack of polish. My paycheck hadn't cleared yet, but I'd forced a smile anyway. I told myself it didn't matter. Family was family. Until that night proved otherwise. It started when Evan mentioned his engagement party. "We're doing it at the Fairmont," he said proudly. "Top floor ballroom. Dad's pulling some strings with the manager." I smiled. "That sounds beautiful." My father looked at me from across the table. "You'll be there, right?" "Of course." He poured himself another glass of wine. "Just remember, Rachel, the dress code isn't casual." The table went silent. Alyssa's fork clinked against her plate. I felt my face heat. "I'll find something nice," I said softly. "That's not what he meant," Evan muttered. And then came the sentence that burned itself into my memory. My father laughed, shook his head slightly and said it, "She's too poor for family Christmas." I remember the sound, the low hum of the heater, the crunch of someone cutting into their pie, my own breath catching. I thought I'd misheard, but no one corrected him. Not Mom, not Evan, not anyone. I wanted to stand up to throw my napkin and say something fierce and clever. But instead I smiled the way women do when they're bleeding on the inside. I looked at my father and said, "Don't worry. I won't embarrass the family." He waved it off as a joke. "You know I'm teasing. Lighten up." Evan laughed. Alyssa giggled. Mom changed the subject to the weather. After dinner, I offered to help clean up. Mom shook her head. "Go relax, honey. You've had a long week." I wanted to tell her that long weeks were all I had left, that the company had downsized, that my rent had gone up, that I was one car repair away from being broke. But what was the point? In this house, truth was always too messy for the tablecloth. When I drove home that night, the snow fell in lazy flakes across the windshield. My father's words echoed in my head, each one louder than the last. Too poor, too poor, too poor. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking. I kicked off my heels and sat on the floor beside the window. Outside, city lights blinked faintly through the snow. I opened my bank app. The number stared back $289.14. That was all I had left after rent. No savings, no backup plan, just a job I'd lost, and a family who measured worth in wine labels and square footage. I should have cried. Instead, I laughed, a short, hollow sound that scared me a little. Then I remembered what my grandmother Margaret used to say, "When you hit rock bottom, stop digging. Look around. There's gold down there if you pay attention." I hadn't thought about her in years. She died when I was 17, long before life had taught me the price of pride. She used to keep a small leather notebook, her dream ledger, she called it. I'd seen her writing in it once, whispering as she scribbled. I didn't understand then that she was tracking investments, not prayers. At 2 a.m, I couldn't sleep. I got up, rummaged through my closet, and found an old box labeled Grandma. Inside, among faded photos and recipe cards, was that same leather notebook. The pages were fragile ink, slightly faded, but her words were still alive. On one page, in her steady cursive, she'd written, "Buy one share every month. Land never leaves. Gold never lies." I flipped through more pages, numbers, small notes, stock symbols from decades ago. At the bottom of one page was a quote, "Freedom isn't bought, it's built." Something shifted in my chest. a pulse of clarity, a whisper of direction. I opened my laptop and searched real estate for beginners. How to start investing with no money. The results flooded in YouTube videos, blogs, forums filled with people who'd started small and built quiet empires. I clicked on one video, a woman sitting in her kitchen explaining how she turned $50 into her first investment property. She smiled into the camera and said, "Don't wait for permission. Learn the system, move in silence." Those words hit me harder than anything my father had said. Move in silence. I made a decision that night, not out of revenge, but survival. I wouldn't prove him wrong with arguments. I'd prove him wrong with the results. I started writing a plan. Cancel Netflix. Sell the old handbags I never use. Learn how to buy my first stock. Save $50 a week, no excuses. It didn't look like much, but it was mine. Before I went to bed, I wrote a note on a sticky pad and stuck it to my mirror. If they mock your silence, make your silence profitable. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and checked my account again. $289. It still wasn't enough to feel safe, but for the first time it felt like a beginning. I didn't know where this path would lead. I didn't know it would take me from that tiny apartment to a mountain in Montana, or that my name would one day trend for something other than shame. All I knew was that my father was wrong about one thing. I wasn't too poor for Christmas. I was just saving up for the day I could buy my own. 3 months after that dinner, my world had shrunk into a single habit: learning. I'd stopped going out, stopped explaining myself to anyone, even stopped answering most calls from my mom. Every night after finishing my shift at a coffee shop downtown, I'd sit at the tiny kitchen table in my apartment with my grandmother's leather notebook open beside me, watching tutorials about stock, gold, and real estate for beginners. The city outside was loud sirens, buses, laughter from the bar below, but my life had gone quiet. A good kind of quiet, the kind where you can finally hear yourself think. I started small. My first trade was one share of an energy company, $15 bought with shaky hands. I watched it every day like a seed I was scared to water too much. When it grew a few cents, I felt rich. When it dropped, I reminded myself this was school, not a gamble. By spring, I'd sold old clothes online, cooked every meal from scratch, and saved enough to enroll in a weekend real estate workshop. It was held in a small hotel ballroom filled with dreamers like me, bartenders, teachers, a few single moms. The instructor, a woman named Clara, who once flipped homes for a living, looked straight at us and said, "Real estate isn't about money. It's about mindset. If you can see value where others see decay, you'll never be poor." That line stayed with me. I scribbled it in Grandma's notebook right under her old note about gold never lying. When the workshop ended, Clara gave everyone a challenge. Go find a property that scares you. Something broken. Something everyone ignores. I laughed at first. I could barely afford rent, let alone real estate. But later that night, scrolling through listings, I found it a small piece of land in Montana. Just one photo, a clearing surrounded by pines, a half-collapsed shed, a sign that said, "Quiet Haven for Sale." The name felt like a whisper meant for me. The price was low, suspiciously low, because the access road had washed out years ago. But the thought of owning something, anything, felt intoxicating. I saved the listing and stared at it for hours. That weekend I told my coworker Helen about it. Helen was 62, silver-haired, sharp-tongued, and the closest thing I had to a mentor. She'd once been an accountant before life knocked her sideways. When I showed her the land photo, she raised an eyebrow. "Montana, huh? Are you planning to build or hide?" "Maybe both," I said. She smiled. "You know, most people chase noise. Maybe you're onto something with this quiet thing." Helen became my secret co-conspirator. She taught me how to track investment shares, how to read property deeds, and how to calculate compound growth. Her coffee breaks turned into financial lectures. "Learn to love boring numbers," she'd say, "because boring money stays." By May, my savings had reached $4,000. It wasn't much, but enough for a down payment on the Montana lot if the seller accepted. I emailed the agent, half expecting to be ignored. To my surprise, he replied, "Within an hour, cash buyers preferred. The property's been sitting for years. Make me an offer." I typed back with shaking hands, "I can do 3,000 cash." He agreed. Just like that, I owned land. A broken patch of dirt 2 states away, but mine. When the confirmation email came through, I stared at the screen for a long time, tears burning the corners of my eyes. Not because I'd succeeded, but because for the first time in my life, no one else's approval mattered. A week later, I called my parents. I wanted to tell them, maybe even surprise them. Dad answered on speakerphone. I could hear Evan in the background, laughing about something. "Hey, Dad," I said. "I just bought a little piece of land in Montana." There was a pause. Then he laughed. "Montana. What for, Rachel? Are you planning to live in the woods now? It's an investment. A project." He chuckled again. "Sweetheart, projects cost money. Don't get in over your head." Evan's voice came through faintly. "Is there Wi-Fi in the woods?" Laughter followed. Anyway, Dad said Evan's helping me with a new venture, something with stocks and hospitality. Maybe one day you can be part of it if you stabilize a bit. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night I took Grandma's notebook out again. Under her quote about freedom being built, I wrote, "They laughed. I'll build anyway." A few weeks later, I boarded a bus to Montana. I couldn't afford a flight. The trip took 20 hours, the kind of journey that gives you too much time to think. When the bus finally pulled into the small town of Flathead, the sky was painted orange with sunset. The air was thick with the scent of crushed pine needles and wet earth. An ancient, clean smell. A local man named Hank drove me out to the property in his pickup truck. "It's a rough road," he warned. "Nobody's used it in years." "That's okay," I said. "I don't mind rough." When we arrived, the place was worse than I expected. The shed had collapsed completely. The ground was uneven, overgrown with wild grass. But there was a stillness there, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I walked to the center of the clearing, boots sinking into the damp soil, and whispered quiet haven. The sound disappeared into the trees, but I felt it come back in the wind. That night I slept in a cheap motel, staring at the cracked ceiling, sketching plans in my notebook. A small cabin, solar panels, a deck overlooking the lake, a place where peace could pay the bills. By morning I'd made up my mind. I wasn't just going to own the land. I was going to build something on it. Something mine from the ground up. I texted Helen a photo of the sunrise over the property. She replied 5 minutes later, "Looks like gold to me." For the first time I understood what she meant. The gold wasn't in the dirt or the trees. It was in the silence, the kind that no one could take away. When I got back to Oregon, I didn't tell my family anything more. Let them think I was lost. Let them mock the woods. They'd see soon enough. I picked up extra shifts, started freelancing, online learning, digital SEO marketing, so I could promote future rentals. Every penny had a purpose now. At night, I'd sit by my window again, city noise humming outside, and whisper to myself, "This is how empires start." Not with noise, but with a plan. And for the first time, I didn't feel poor. I felt powerful. The first time I stood on my land alone, it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like responsibility. The air hit me sharp, primal, a mix of cold pine sap and damp earth. My boots sank into the ground, soft from last night's rain. All around me was stillness, no traffic, no sirens, no one to tell me I couldn't do this. Just me, a cheap tent, and the echo of my father's voice saying I'd never build anything that lasted. I unrolled a map of the property on a folding table I'd borrowed from Hank, the local who'd driven me here the first time. He'd laughed when I said I wanted to clear the land myself. "You from the city?" he asked. "Seattle," I said. He grinned. "Then you've got a lot of learning to do." He wasn't wrong. The land looked peaceful, but hid its challenges. Fallen trees, rocky soil, and an access road that had eroded into a muddy path. The first week I camped in a tent and used a shovel to clear brush. I learned how to use a chainsaw from YouTube and how to set posts for a foundation by trial and error. My palms blistered, my back ached, and every night I collapsed under the stars, feeling both defeated and alive. At night I'd build fires from damp wood and read Grandma Margaret's notebook by the flickering light. One line became my mantra: don't chase comfort, build it. By the end of the second week, I met the neighbors, or what passed for neighbors out there. A woman named Nora stopped by one afternoon with a basket of cornbread. She lived 2 miles down the ridge and owned a horse ranch. "You're the one fixing the Quiet Haven lot?" she asked. "That's me." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You're either brave or crazy. Maybe both." She started dropping by once a week after that, offering help, sometimes bringing supplies. I didn't tell her much about why I was there. People in small towns didn't ask for details, they read them in your eyes. By summer, I'd managed to build a small wooden platform where the old shed had been. It wasn't much, but when I stood on it looking over the lake below, I felt something shift inside me. This was the opposite of my father's world: no false shine, nothing to hide. Just work. Honest, dirty, solitary work. Helen called every few days to check in. "You're really doing it, huh?" she said one night. "Trying to," I replied, wiping sawdust from my arms. "Remember what I told you. It's not about building fast. It's about building right." "I know," I said. "I just don't want to fail." She laughed softly. "Failure's part of the foundation, sweetheart. Just make sure it's level." That night I couldn't sleep. The stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch. I thought about what she said about failure being part of the foundation. Maybe every cruel word I'd ever heard was part of it too. Maybe too poor for Christmas was just the first brick. By August, I'd saved enough to hire a local carpenter, an older man named Tom. He didn't talk much, just showed up every morning with tools and quiet patience. He taught me how to measure, cut, and join wood properly. "You got good instincts," he said one afternoon after watching me align the deck boards. "Instinct doesn't fix mistakes," I said. He smiled. "No, but it tells you when to start over." We worked side by side for weeks. Each nail I hammered felt like an answer to every doubt I'd ever carried. By the time we finished the cabin frame, I could see it: my home, my proof, my revenge wrapped in cedar and silence. When the last board went up, I took a photo and sent it to Helen with one line: "Quiet Haven is real." She replied immediately, "You just built your first share of peace." I laughed out loud, sitting on the unfinished steps. Peace. The word felt heavier than it sounded. Maybe peace wasn't the absence of noise. Maybe it was the moment you stopped needing applause. One afternoon, while clearing rocks near the path, I found an old metal sign buried in the dirt. It read, "Moore Family Investment, 1983. My father's company name." My heart froze. For a moment I thought he might have been right, that the land had belonged to him once. I brought it inside the cabin, wiped the rust away, and stared at it. The edges were bent, the letters faded. I didn't know whether to keep it or throw it into the fire. In the end, I hung it on the inside wall, facing inward, where only I could see it. A reminder of what I was building away from, not toward. In September, I bought my first ounce of gold, just a small bar from an online seller. I held it in my palms, surprised by its weight. Solid, quiet, real. It wasn't about wealth. It was about trust. Gold didn't lie, Grandma had said, and now I understood. It held value the way silence held truth, steadily, without apology. I started documenting my progress online, just photos of the land, the cabin, the sunsets. I didn't show my face, didn't tell my story. I used the tag, #QuietHavenBuild. Within weeks, strangers started commenting. "This looks peaceful. Where is this? I wish I could escape like that." I wasn't trying to go viral. I was just trying to remember who I was becoming. When winter came, the first snow fell in slow, quiet flakes that covered everything in white. I stood on the deck watching it fall, feeling the same cold sting on my cheeks I'd felt that Christmas night at my parents' house. Only now it didn't hurt. I thought about my father again. About how he'd measured worth in what he could display, not what he could endure. I whispered into the cold air, "This is what you couldn't buy." Inside the cabin smelled of pine and sawdust, still unfinished but alive. I brewed coffee on the small gas stove and wrote in my grandmother's notebook, investment portfolio, 1 acre of peace, 1 ounce of gold, one promise to never go back. The wind howled outside, but I felt steady. I knew the next part would be harder, finishing the cabin, opening it to guests, making it profitable. But I also knew something had already shifted. I wasn't building a structure anymore. I was building a story. And this time, no one else would write the ending for me. By the time the first spring thaw came, the cabin stood solid against the wind. The logs had darkened from winter storms, the roof held firm, and inside it smelled of cedar and determination. I called it Quiet Haven, just like the old sign said, only now the name belonged to me. It wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The deck still needed sealing, the wiring wasn't up to code, and there was no plumbing, just a metal bucket and a dream. But it was mine. Every nail, every bruise, every night I spent wondering if I'd gone completely insane. Helen visited in April. She showed up in her old Jeep, windows down, hair blowing in the wind like she was 30 again. When she stepped out and looked around, she whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. You really did it." "Almost," I said. "Almost is more than most." We stood there for a while, watching the sun rise over the lake. The ice had finally melted and the lake was a sheet of dark mirror, holding the entire sky motionless. For the first time in years, I felt proud of something that couldn't be taken away. That night we sat by the fire, sipping cheap whiskey and talking about money. Not the glamorous kind, the real kind. "Have you ever thought about how weird it is?" I asked. "People chase numbers on screens but forget the ground under their feet." Helen chuckled. "That's why you'll make it. You're the kind of fool who still believes in land." "Gold too," I said, smiling. "Gold's fine," she said. "But peace, that's the rarest currency." She was right, though peace had a price tag I hadn't expected. The next few months tested everything I had: money, patience, even belief. I'd underestimated the cost of materials, the taxes, the permits. I sold my old car, took freelance SEO jobs online, and learned how to make every dollar stretch twice its size. Some nights I'd sit on the deck laptop open, building digital campaigns for small businesses, while the crickets sang around me. It wasn't glamorous, but each project funded a new piece of Quiet Haven floorboards, windows paint. My body ached, but my soul was steady. Then one morning I opened my inbox to a message from my father. Subject line: family update. My chest tightened before I even clicked it. "Rachel," it began. "Your brother Evan got promoted. We're planning a big celebration in Seattle. You should come. Bring whoever you've been spending your time with these days. You need a break from all that wilderness stuff." I read it twice, then a third time. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't even spell the name of my cabin right. Helen saw my face when she stopped by that afternoon. Bad news. "Just my father pretending I don't exist. Until there's an audience," I said. "You going?" "No." "Good," she said. "Let the ghosts celebrate without you." But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through social media and saw photos from the event: Evan in a navy suit, my father, with a glass of champagne, the caption, "More legacy in motion." Legacy. That word again. It followed me like a shadow. A few days later, a man in a black pickup pulled up the dirt road. He introduced himself as Dave, a realtor from the next town. "Heard you fixed up the old Moore property," he said. My heart skipped. "It's not the Moore property anymore." He grinned. "Sure, but people talk. You've done a hell of a job. Any chance you're looking to sell?" "No," I said quickly. "Could fetch a good price now that the lake view's cleared. Not interested." He nodded, tipped his hat, and drove away. But that night I couldn't shake the thought. The Moore property. That's how everyone saw it. That's how he saw it. I was just the girl who cleaned up after a legacy that had left her out. That's when I decided to make Quiet Haven official. I registered the business, bought a domain name, and set up a simple website with photos of the cabin and a short line, "A private escape built from silence." It felt small, but it was a start. I listed the cabin on a travel site under Eco Retreats. The description read, "A one-cabin getaway for those who need peace more than luxury." The first booking came 2 weeks later, a couple from Idaho looking for a quiet weekend. They paid $450 for 2 nights. I nearly cried when the notification hit my phone. Helen laughed when I told her. "Told you peace would pay off." "I'm not rich," I said. "Not yet," she replied. "But you're solvent, and that's halfway to freedom." The couple left a glowing review online. "This place feels like exhaling." That review changed everything. Within a month, every weekend was booked. Travelers started sharing photos: the deck, the lake, the fire pit. The hashtag #QuietHaven began popping up everywhere. One morning, I woke to an email from a travel blogger asking to feature the cabin in an article titled "Hidden Gems of Montana." I said yes, before I could overthink it. When the piece went live, my phone exploded. Requests flooded in bookings, collaborations, even brand deals. My quiet escape wasn't so quiet anymore. But for every bit of attention, a shadow followed. Comments like, "Isn't that part of the Moore family estate? Didn't her dad help her fund that?" I ignored them at first. Then one morning I got a message from my brother. "Nice article. Dad says the place looks great. Maybe we should come visit." My stomach dropped. I typed and deleted my reply a dozen times before finally sending, "It's not open to family right now." He didn't answer. But I knew this wasn't the end. Families like mine never stayed quiet when money or pride was involved. That night I stood on the deck, the wind cool against my face, and whispered into the darkness, "You called me too poor for Christmas. Let's see how poor silence can be." The moon reflected off the lake, turning everything silver. The air was cold but clean, the kind of cold that keeps you awake honest. Inside, I lit a small candle and opened Grandma's notebook again. On a blank page, I wrote, "Profit 1 weekend of peace. Investment every night I refuse to quit." The flame flickered, casting light across the wooden walls I built myself. Peace had a price, yes, but so did regret. And for the first time, I could finally afford the right one. The article hit the internet on a Friday morning. By noon, Quiet Haven was everywhere. A travel blogger had titled it, "The Hidden Retreat," built by a woman who chose silence over revenge. The words felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. Photos of the cabin, my deck, the lake, the hand-carved signs circulated on Pinterest and Instagram. Influencers reposted it. The article reached 500,000 views in 2 days. Bookings skyrocketed. My phone buzzed nonstop. It was the kind of attention people dream of, and the kind I'd spent my whole life avoiding. Helen called first. "Congratulations, you viral hermit," she said, laughing. "It's weird," I admitted. "People keep tagging me, but they don't even know me." "That's fame, honey. The loudest silence wins." I laughed, but it felt hollow. Because behind all the excitement was something else, a quiet dread that my father would see too. 2 days later, he did. I was sweeping the deck when my phone rang. Dad flashed across the screen. I froze. The last time we'd spoken, he'd told me to get my life together. Now he wanted to talk. I let it ring out, heart pounding. He called again. Then again. 10 times in a row. Finally, I answered. "Rachel," his voice boomed through the speaker, too familiar, too certain. "I saw the article. Incredible work. You should have told us you were building something like this. It wasn't a family project," I said. "Oh, come on," he said, laughing softly. "Don't be dramatic. The article says the land used to be part of our old holdings. That means technically it's still part of the Moore family legacy." I felt the air leave my lungs. "No, it's not. I bought this land, Dad. Myself." He paused, then lowered his tone. "Rachel, this could be big for all of us. We could expand, make Quiet Haven a chain. More family retreats. Has a nice ring to it." I almost dropped the phone. "You kicked me out of that family, remember?" I said quietly. "That's not fair," he replied. "We were trying to help you grow up. By calling me too poor for Christmas." He went silent. For once, he had no clever line to throw back. "I built this," I said. "Every inch of it. Without your money, without your name, you don't get to take it now. Then I hung up. For a long time, I just stood there staring at the mountains. The wind was sharp, cutting through the pines. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a simmering fury, like my father had managed to drag the noise back into my quiet world, proving his reach was still too long. By that evening, I'd received 27 missed calls and 3 voicemails. Each one sounded more desperate than the last. "Rachel, we need to talk. This isn't what you think. Don't make this a family fight." Family fight. That's exactly what it was. The next day, Helen drove up. I was sitting on the porch steps staring at the snow line creeping down the ridge. She took one look at me and said, "They found you, didn't they?" "Yeah. And he wants to turn it into a family business." She snorted. "Of course he does. People only call it family when it's profitable." I didn't reply. She sat beside me, handed me a cup of coffee, and we watched the lake shimmer in silence. "You know what you should do," she said finally. "What? Tell your story, your version, before they tell it to you." That night I sat by the fire with my laptop and wrote a post titled, "How I Built Quiet Haven." It wasn't dramatic, just the truth. I shared photos of the land before and after, talked about how I'd saved every dollar, learned SEO and real estate for beginners from scratch, and built something from what people once mocked. At the end, I wrote, "Quiet Haven isn't a family legacy. It's proof that peace is built, not inherited." I hit publish at 11:52 p.m. By morning, it had 200,000 views. Comments poured in, "This is what resilience looks like." I'm crying. "You just gave me hope." Family doesn't always mean support. The post spread faster than the original article. Podcasts reached out. Journalists wanted interviews. Every major travel page shared the story. And as the world cheered, my father called again. This time I picked up. "Rachel," he said, voice trembling with forced calm. "You need to take that post down. It makes the family look honest," I interrupted. "Unstable," he hissed. "You're embarrassing yourself." "No, Dad," I said. "I'm freeing myself." Then I ended the call and blocked his number. That night, snow started to fall again. I stood on the deck watching the flakes drift down, covering the wood in a thin white sheet. For the first time, I didn't feel cold. I felt untouchable. Inside, I wrote a new entry in Grandma's notebook, lesson number 47. "Silence is expensive, but it pays better than approval." When Helen came back the next day, she found me sitting on the floor surrounded by maps and receipts. "What's all this expansion?" I said. Her eyebrows rose. "You're building 2 new cabins by spring, and maybe a meditation deck by the lake." She smiled. "You really are turning this into an empire, huh?" "Not an empire," I said. "Just a quiet revolution." We both laughed. By the end of that week, my story had been featured in Forbes Women under the headline, "The Entrepreneur Who Built Peace into Profit." It was surreal seeing my name next to phrases like stock investments, real estate for beginners, and women building wealth. I hadn't set out to become a symbol. I just wanted to stop feeling invisible. But maybe that's how it happens when you stop trying to be seen. The world finally looks your way. A few days later, I received one more message from my father. Not a voicemail, not an email, an old-fashioned letter. "Rachel," it read, "you're doing well. I see that. Maybe too well. Remember, the Moore name built this country before you were born. Don't turn your back on it." I folded the letter and threw it into the fire. The paper curled and blackened until it was nothing but ash. Outside, the snow kept falling silent and relentless. I poured a cup of tea, stepped out onto the deck, and whispered to the night, "Quiet Haven was never yours to begin with." The wind answered softly through the pines, carrying away the last trace of his voice. And for the first time in my life, my silence didn't just protect me. It spoke for me. Within days, bookings doubled. The waiting list stretched for months. Guests flew in from all over the country, calling Quiet Haven a healing space, a hidden treasure. Each one took photos, tagged the resort, and spread the story further. The viral post had done more than make me visible. It made Quiet Haven a brand. The problem was, I didn't know how to run one. I hired 2 part-time workers from town, set up a basic booking system, and tried to keep up with the emails. Nights turned into mornings. The silence that had once comforted me now buzzed with notifications. Then one morning Helen said, "You need help." "I have you," I said. She shook her head. "You need someone who understands business marketing, taxes, the boring stuff." I hesitated. Bringing someone else in felt like losing control. Quiet Haven had always been personal private. But she was right. So I posted an opening for a small business assistant. A week later, a woman named Layla showed up. She was in her early 30s, calm, sharp, the kind of person who didn't waste words. She looked around the property and said, "You built this from scratch." "Every board," I said. She smiled. "Then let's build the systems to protect it." With Layla's help, Quiet Haven transformed from a dream into a functioning business. She set up a professional website, automated payments, handled taxes, and helped me trademark the name. One night as we worked late in the cabin office, she said, "You realize this isn't just a resort anymore, right? It's a movement." I looked up from my laptop. A movement for what? For every woman who was told she was too poor, too small, too late. The words hit hard. That week, a TV producer from a national show reached out. They wanted to film a feature segment called "Women Who Built from the Ground Up." I almost said no. Cameras felt like noise again, and I'd spent years trying to protect my quiet. But Helen said, "You don't have to be loud. Just be honest." So I said yes. The crew arrived in late autumn. They filmed me chopping firewood, checking cabins, walking by the lake at sunrise. During the interview, the reporter asked Rachel, "When your family said you were too poor for Christmas, did you ever imagine you'd end up here?" I paused, staring at the camera. "No. But maybe that's the point. You don't need their imagination when you have your own." The segment aired 2 weeks later. It exploded online, 5 million views in 3 days. The phone rang non-stop. Brands wanted collaborations. A publisher offered a book deal. Even a crypto investor emailed about future digital retreats. I turned off my phone for 3 days. The fame felt surreal, but underneath it was something deeper, a steady hum of validation I didn't know I'd been craving. I walked through the resort one evening, snow beginning to fall again, lights glowing warm from the cabins. I'd built something real, something that existed without permission. But with attention came distortion. A few online threads started claiming I wasn't self-made. "She had family money," one said. "No way a barista built that." Another showed an old photo of me at my parents' house captioned, "More family daughter turns family land into profit." At first I ignored it, but then the comments started reaching my inbox. Some were kind, others are cruel. Helen found me sitting on the porch one night, scrolling through them. "Hey," she said gently, "stop feeding the noise." "They think I lied," I said quietly. "Let them. Truth doesn't need to shout." She handed me a mug of tea and sat beside me. The wind whistled through the pines, the same sound I'd fallen asleep to that first night on the land. "You know what I think," she said. "What I think the people who laughed at you just realize they can't control you anymore. And that scares them." I didn't reply, but she was right. That night I lit a fire and opened Grandma's notebook. On the next blank page I wrote, "Silence speaks loudest when it no longer needs to explain itself." 2 weeks later, Quiet Haven was featured again, this time in Business Insider. The headline read, "The Viral Resort That Redefined Wealth." The story framed me not as a victim but as a strategist. They wrote about my investments in stock and gold, my side courses on real estate for beginners, and my belief that peace could be profitable. I smiled when I read that part. Grandma would have loved it. But fame travels faster than truth. By December, I received an email from an unknown address, subject family property rights, more holdings inquiry. My stomach turned. I clicked it open. "Dear Ms. Moore," it read, "We are reaching out on behalf of your father, Richard Moore, regarding ownership clarification related to the Quiet Haven land purchase." I stopped reading. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From fury. I looked out the window at the cabins glowing against the snow. The world saw beauty and peace. My father saw property and profit. He was coming back not with words this time, but with paperwork. I closed my laptop, heart steady, mind sharp. The silence around me didn't feel gentle anymore. It felt ready. Outside, the wind rose whispering through the pines like a warning. I whispered back, "You can't take what you never built." The fire popped, casting sparks into the night. Quiet Haven had finally found its voice, and it was mine. The morning I woke up to a million views, the mountain looked different. The sun hit the lake, turning the surface to a blinding sheet of light. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, emails, messages, brands asking for partnerships, reporters begging for quotes. But among them, one name made my stomach twist: Dad. His email subject line read, "Family property should stay in the family." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Rachel, we're proud of you," he wrote. "The resort looks incredible, but remember the Montana land came from family assets. We should discuss co-ownership. More Family Retreats has a nice ring to it." My hands went cold. I read the line again, slower this time, catching the undertone. It wasn't an offer. It was a warning dressed as generosity. By noon, the phone rang again. Evan this time. I let it go to voicemail, but he called back, his name flashing across the screen like an accusation. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Rach, Dad's just trying to help," he said quickly, his voice too bright, too rehearsed. "He's proud of you. We all are." "Proud," I said flatly. "Is that what we're calling this now?" "Come on," he said, the practiced chuckle slipping through. "You know, Dad, he doesn't mean things the way they sound." "Oh, I remember exactly how he meant them. He said I was too poor for Christmas, Evan." There was silence. That was years ago. Yeah, and every board of this place was built on those words. I hung up. The cabin felt too small after that. I stepped outside, the cold air cutting clean against my skin. The silence that used to comfort me now pressed tight against my chest. Across the lake, the reflection of Quiet Haven trembled with every ripple. My peace, my proof, had just become a target. Helen found me that evening sitting on the steps. She didn't ask. She just handed me a cup of coffee and said, "They're trying to rewrite the story." "Let them," I muttered. "Then you better tell yours first." That night, I opened my laptop and started typing. When success comes, the people who doubted you often return not to apologize, but to reclaim what they once discarded. I didn't name anyone. I didn't have to. The truth already knew its shape. By morning, the post had 300,000 shares. By noon, it was everywhere: Twitter, Reddit, business blogs. The comments flooded in. She turned pain into profit. "This woman is the definition of resilience. Let's hear it for the ones who build quietly." But not everyone was cheering. On my brother's Instagram, a post appeared, "Family values mean sharing, not hoarding success." Alyssa commented with a heart emoji. My father reposted a family photo with the caption, "Legacy is meant to be shared." Suddenly, the internet wasn't just watching, it was taking sides. Some called me selfish. Others called me inspiring. And somewhere between those two words, the truth started to fracture. Helen came over that night, scrolling through her phone. "They're making this about money," she said. "It was never about money," I replied. "It was about being seen." So what now? I closed my laptop. Now I'll let the work talk. And I did. Instead of arguing online, I poured my energy back into Quiet Haven. I hired local women to help build 2 more cabins. We opened a small cafe by the lake called Still Lake Cafe, serving strong coffee and homemade pastries. Every week I posted updates, new constructions, sunrise photos, tips on building your dream with whatever you have. The noise faded, not because it stopped, but because I stopped feeding it. One night, as I reviewed the resort's finances, I realized something impossible. Quiet Haven had crossed 6 figures in bookings. My eyes stung. Not from pride, but relief. Every insult, every rejection, every night I doubted myself, it had all become something tangible, something that couldn't be taken back. The next morning, a travel magazine listed Quiet Haven as one of America's top 5 hidden retreats. The headline read, "A solo female entrepreneur building peace in a noisy world." I read it twice. The words felt lighter than the ones my father had once thrown at me. But peace never lasts long when people mistake it for weakness. That evening, my phone rang again, an unknown Seattle number. I hesitated before answering. "Ms. Moore," a man's voice said. "This is David Langley, your father's attorney. He's requesting mediation for property and name rights." My pulse thudded in my ears. "You're joking." "I'm afraid not. He believes the Quiet Haven land overlaps with a Moore Holdings investment from the 1980s. "That land was abandoned before I was born," I said. "Nevertheless, he wants to discuss terms." The words "discuss terms" landed like stones. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was the start of a siege. I hung up. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring out the window at the pines bending in the wind. The stillness I'd fought so hard to build had shifted again, cracking under the weight of an old war I never wanted to fight. Later that night, I sat on the floor with Grandma's notebook open in my lap. I traced her handwriting with my finger and whispered aloud her line, "Peace without boundaries invites invasion." I closed the notebook slowly. The next morning, I called Helen. "Get Jim on the phone," I said. "It's time we reminded them who owns this ground." The wind outside rose, carrying snow across the lake. I watched it scatter like silver dust, sharp and bright. The message was clear now. He wasn't just asking for a share. He was coming to take it. And I was done being quiet for his comfort. The legal envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. Thick paper embossed with the name Moore Holdings, LLC. It lay on my doorstep like a threat wrapped in professionalism. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. Still, I did. Formal request for ownership review. The letter was polite, precise, and venomous. My father was claiming partial rights to the land on which Quiet Haven stood. He argued it had once belonged to the Moore family investment portfolio, an asset written off decades ago but never officially released. It didn't matter that I'd bought it legally. He didn't want the land. He wanted the narrative. I sat on the deck, the cold biting through my jeans, and stared at the lake until the words blurred. I'd built this place to heal. Now it was turning into a courtroom. Helen found me an hour later. I handed her the letter without a word. She read it, sighed, and muttered, "He's really doing this. Looks like it." "Then you're not fighting alone." She called her old friend from Missoula, a retired lawyer named Jim, who agreed to take the case. Jim was calm, deliberate, with eyes that saw through ego. After reading the letter, he leaned back in his chair and said, "He's bluffing." "Bluffing?" I asked. "Your paperwork's clean. He's testing how far you'll bend." "And if I don't?" Jim smiled slightly. "Then we'll teach him what happens when you underestimate silence." For weeks I tried to keep running the resort like nothing was wrong. Guests still came, artists, teachers, women starting over. They'd sit by the fire, reading or journaling, unaware that the woman who served their coffee was fighting to keep the ground beneath their feet. At night, I worked on the legal documents, cross-checking titles and dates, until my eyes burned. The storm outside matched the one in my chest, sharp, relentless. Then came the press leak. A small business blog published an article titled, "Quiet Haven Resort Faces Family Ownership Dispute." Within hours, my inbox flooded. Journalists wanted statements. Strangers offered advice. A few trolls resurfaced, calling me ungrateful, greedy, a fraud. My father, of course, gave his own quote to the media. "It's a misunderstanding. We're a family that values legacy, not conflict." Legacy. Again that word. It made my teeth clench. Helen stayed close through it all. "Let him talk," she said. "He's digging his own hole." "But he's turning the story around," I said. "He's making it sound like I stole from him. Then take the story back." So I did. I recorded a short video on my phone. Nothing scripted, nothing glamorous. Just me sitting on the deck at sunset. "My name is Rachel Moore," I said. "I bought this land with the last of my savings. I built every wall you see here. My family didn't believe in me until the internet did. Now they're calling it a misunderstanding." But peace isn't a misunderstanding. It's a choice, and I'm not giving mine away. I uploaded it without thinking. By morning, it had 3 million views. The comments poured in, overwhelmingly supportive. People shared their own stories of being dismissed by family of rebuilding from nothing. The hashtag #BuildYourPeace started trending. Helen cried when she saw it. "You turned their lawsuit into a movement," she said. "I didn't plan that." "Maybe not. But you meant every word." Even the media began shifting tone. Business magazines ran stories about independent women entrepreneurs facing family opposition. Interviews flooded in. Layla, my operations manager, handled them all. "You just focus on the cabins," she told me. "We'll handle the noise." Still, the lawsuit didn't disappear. My father's lawyers doubled down, filing official claims in state court. I'd never been inside a courtroom before. The morning of the hearing, I wore the same black blazer I'd worn to that last family dinner years ago, the one he'd mocked as too cheap for the Fairmont. In the courtroom, my father looked smaller than I remembered. Older but still polished. He avoided my eyes. When it was my turn to speak, my hands didn't shake. "I didn't take anything from this family," I said. "I took what they abandoned, the belief that worth comes from work. Quiet Haven was built from silence, not inheritance." The judge nodded slowly, reviewing the documents Jim had prepared. The room was so still I could hear my own breathing. After a few tense minutes, the judge spoke. "All ownership records are valid. The property belongs solely to Ms. Rachel Moore." I exhaled. Dad's face hardened, then softened into something I didn't recognize. Defeat, maybe. He didn't say a word as he left. Outside the courthouse, snow began to fall. Reporters gathered, cameras flashing. I didn't stop for interviews. I just looked up at the sky and whispered, "It's over." "No," she said. "It's beginning." She was right. That night I drove back to Quiet Haven. The lights from the cabins glowed across the lake, soft and steady. Inside my cabin, I poured a small glass of wine and opened Grandma's notebook again. On the next page I wrote, "They tried to bury me under paperwork. I built a foundation out of it." The following week, I posted a final update for my followers. The lawsuit was dismissed. Quiet Haven is safe. Thank you for reminding me that peace isn't silent, it's strong. The post went viral again, but this time the attention felt different. The world wasn't gawking at my pain. It was echoing my resilience. Helen raised a toast that night at the cafe. "To silence," she said. "To storms," I added. "They teach us to build stronger roofs." Everyone laughed, clinking glasses as snow fell outside. Later, when I stood alone on the deck, the lake perfectly still beneath the moon, I whispered to myself, this was never revenge. This was reclamation. And in the distance, the wind carried the sound of peace, steady, unbreakable mine. The first morning after the court hearing, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was light, clean, like the air after a thunderstorm. The mountain looked brighter, and for the first time in months I slept without waking to the sound of my phone buzzing. I walked down to the lake barefoot, the grass still wet with snowmelt. My reflection looked back at me, older, calmer, unrecognizable from the woman who once drove through this same valley chasing proof. I'd won the battle for Quiet Haven, but the bigger one had always been the one inside me. Helen joined me not long after, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. So she said, handing one to me, "How does it feel to win?" I smiled faintly. "Strange. Like I should be celebrating, but I just want to sit still." "That's how peace sneaks up on you," she said, settling beside me. "It doesn't roar. It whispers." That day we didn't talk about business or bookings. We talked about life, how she'd lost her marriage after 20 years, how I'd lost myself trying to fit into a family that never saw me. The wind off the lake was sharp, but it didn't sting anymore. A few days later, I started sketching again. Not buildings this time, but ideas, programs, retreats, workshops. I wanted Quiet Haven to become more than a getaway. I wanted it to be a blueprint for starting over. Layla came by that afternoon, scanning the sketches spread across the table. "You're thinking of expanding," she said. "Not just physically," I replied. "Emotionally, spiritually." She raised a brow. "That sounds expensive." "It will be," I said, "but not in dollars." The 3 of us, me, Helen, and Layla, spent hours brainstorming. We came up with the Quiet Haven Renewal Program, a 6-week course where women could learn about financial independence, investing, and self-worth. We'd teach basic stock and share literacy, a little crypto awareness, and real estate for beginners. But more than that, we'd teach silence, the kind that rebuilds from within. When the program launched online, I expected maybe 50 signups. We hit 500 in the first week. Stories poured in from all over: single mothers, retired teachers, women in their 50s starting over after divorce. One wrote, "I found your story the night I almost gave up. Now I'm saving to buy my own piece of land." Every message felt like a heartbeat echoing across the mountains. The same week I got another letter from my father, not from lawyers this time, but handwritten. "Rachel," it began, "I watched your interview. You spoke well. Maybe I didn't see it then, but you were right to do things your way. I hope someday we can talk." I folded the letter and placed it in Grandma's notebook without replying. Forgiveness wasn't a gift I could hand out like hospitality. It had to grow on its own time. Instead, I focused on the resort. Spring was turning into summer and Quiet Haven was blooming. The cabins were full, the cafe was thriving, and laughter echoed across the lake every evening. It was everything I'd built for, and yet part of me felt a strange emptiness, like I'd outgrown even the peace I'd once craved. Helen noticed. "You've been restless," she said one night as we sat by the fire pit. "I guess I thought winning would feel different." "It never does," she said. "Because winning isn't the point. Building is." That night I walked to the water's edge and let her words sink in. Building. That's what I'd been doing my whole life, out of pain, out of pride, out of necessity. It was time to build out of love. I walked back up to the cabin and immediately began structuring the first week's curriculum. A week later, I hosted the first Quiet Haven gathering, a weekend retreat for the women in our online program. 60 of them showed up. They came from everywhere: Nevada, Texas, Florida, carrying stories of loss and rebirth. We sat in a circle that first evening, a fire crackling between us, the lake reflecting the stars. One woman said, "I used to think starting over meant running away. But this weekend I realized it means coming home." I didn't speak much that night. I just listened. Because that was the heart of it. The silence that had saved me was now saving others. By the end of the retreat, I knew Quiet Haven had become something I hadn't planned. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a movement, a living, breathing example that peace and profit could coexist. A week after the retreat ended, I received a call from a journalist with the Wall Street Ledger. She wanted to write a feature about how women are redefining wealth through purpose. I agreed on one condition: that it wasn't about viral fame, but about the lessons. When the article was published, the headline read, "From Broke to Builder, the Woman Who Turned Silence into Gold." I read it once, twice, then closed my laptop. It wasn't the headline that mattered. It was the last line. It said Rachel Moore didn't just build a resort. She built a way home for those who had none. I cried, not because I felt victorious, but because for the first time I felt understood. Later that night, as I wrote in Grandma's notebook, I added a new lesson: the rebuild within always costs more than money, but it's the only kind of wealth that lasts. The next morning, I hiked to the ridge above Quiet Haven. From there, the entire property spread out below me. The cabins, the cafe, the lake gleaming like liquid glass. This was no longer the place I'd built to prove something. It was the place I'd built to belong. The wind brushed against my face, carrying the smell of pine and earth. I thought of my father, my brother, the voices that once made me doubt my worth. Then I thought of the hundreds of women now writing their own versions of this story, each one turning silence into strength. For the first time, I whispered thank you and meant it. Not to them, but to the version of me who refused to quit. Because she was the foundation beneath it all. And finally, she could rest. The message came at dusk, just as the lake turned copper in the fading light. It was from Evan. "Dad wants to come see the place. Says he needs to talk face to face. Don't shut him out." I stared at the words until they blurred. The air outside was still thick with the smell of rain, The kind of quiet that warned you a storm was near. I hadn't seen my father in almost 3 years. He'd haunted the headlines, the emails, the lawsuit, but never the land. The idea of him walking through Quiet Haven, touching the walls I built, breathing the air I earned it made my stomach twist. Helen found me pacing the porch. "He's coming, isn't he?" she asked. I nodded. "Then you decide what story this meeting tells. Yours or his." The next morning I woke up before sunrise. I brewed coffee, walked down to the dock, and watched the fog roll across the lake. Part of me wanted to disappear into it, but another part, the one that had hammered every nail here, refused to hide. By noon, a black SUV appeared on the dirt road. It stopped just short of the cafe. When my father stepped out, I barely recognized him. The confidence was still there, but age had softened the edges. His suit didn't fit the setting, city sharp against wilderness calm. He smiled, hesitant. "Rachel. Dad." He looked around, eyes tracing the cabins, the trees, the mountain behind me. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "It's home." For a while we just stood there. The wind moved through the pines, and for once neither of us filled the silence with small talk. Finally he said, "I didn't come to fight." "I'm listening." He pulled off his gloves, stuffed them into his pocket, and looked down at the ground. "When I said what I said that Christmas, I thought I was protecting you. The world's hard, Rachel. I wanted you to be tougher than I was. You called me poor," I said. He flinched just slightly. "I was wrong." The words hung there, unexpected and heavy. He took a step closer. "I saw your last interview, the one about rebuilding peace. You sounded like your grandmother." That made my chest tighten. "You knew about her notebook?" He nodded. "She taught me how to save and how to buy my first share. But I forgot everything she really meant." "You didn't." The air felt thick with ghosts, his pride, my anger, her wisdom. He looked toward the lake again. "I didn't file that lawsuit for money," he said quietly. "I did it because I couldn't stand that you'd done something without me. Without the family name." "You wanted control," I said. "I wanted connection," he said, voice low. I just didn't know the difference anymore. I studied him for a long time. For the first time in my life, I saw not the man who'd belittled me, but the boy who'd probably been belittled by someone else. I motioned toward the cafe. "Come inside." We sat by the window, coffee steaming between us. Helen gave me a look from behind the counter, half warning, half support, and then left us alone. Dad ran his hand over the wooden table. "You built this every inch." He nodded slowly. "You always had more grit than I gave you credit for." I leaned back, studying him. "You taught me something too, you know. Oh, how to survive rejection." He looked up sharply, then smiled, small but real. "Guess we both built something out of that." The conversation shifted after that, gentle, as the rain started outside. We talked about Grandma, about the old lake house, about the company he'd finally sold. He told me he'd been diagnosed with high blood pressure, that he'd been thinking a lot about time. "I've lost a lot of it," he said. "And maybe I can't fix the past, but I'd like to visit just as a guest if you'd let me." It was quiet for a long moment. Then I said, "You can visit, but this place stays mine." He nodded, no argument. Fair. When he left, the rain had stopped. The road glistened under the sun. I watched the SUV disappear down the hill, the sound of tires fading into the distance. Helen appeared beside me. "Well, I think he finally heard me," I said. Or maybe she said, "You finally stopped needing him to." That night I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the lake, the moon silvering the water. My reflection shimmered beside Grandma's old sign still hanging inside the cabin window, the words, "Quiet Haven," glowing faintly in the light. I opened her notebook again, running my fingers over the worn pages. Near the back, I found a quote I'd never noticed before, written in her looping script. "Wealth is not how much you own, but how much peace you keep when they try to take it." I smiled through tears. That was it. The full circle. The lesson hidden in every bruise and every battle. In the morning, I called Layla. "Let's start Quiet Haven 2.0, I said. She laughed. "Are you serious?" As serious as silence. The plan was simple. expand beyond Montana. Build sister properties across the country, all focused on women rebuilding their lives. Teach them about stock share crypto real estate for beginners and gold the languages of independence. But this time, I wouldn't do it alone. Helen, Layla, and I drafted a proposal. We'd sell community shares, small affordable investments, so the women who learned from us could own a piece of the next haven. That night, I announced it online. The post read, "For everyone who ever started from nothing, this is your share in peace." The comments came fast. "I'm in. Finally a legacy for us. From broke to built together." As I read through them, the fear that had haunted me for years dissolved into something steadier, something sacred. The ghosts of judgment, shame, and doubt had all walked through my door and left empty-handed. I closed Grandma's notebook for the last time and whispered quietly, "Thank you." Outside, the lake was still. The world for once wasn't asking anything of me. It was simply listening. And in that stillness, I finally understood. Peace doesn't erase the ghosts. It just teaches them where to sit. A year after my father's visit, Quiet Haven had become more than a resort. It was alive in ways I never imagined. The cabins were always booked, the cafe had expanded into a lakeside restaurant, and women from all over the country came not just to rest, but to learn. The Quiet Haven Foundation was no longer just an idea scribbled in my notebook. It was real, an entire program dedicated to helping women rebuild from the ground up. Each week I watched new faces arrive with the same look I'd once worn, lost scared, but desperate to believe that peace was still possible. On the first morning of our new course, I stood before 20 women gathered in the main hall. Some were divorced, some laid off, some just tired of pretending. Behind me, the whiteboard read, "From broke to built." I took a breath and said, "We're not here to chase success. We're here to build stability, the kind that no one can take away. You'll learn about stock shares, gold, crypto, real estate for beginners. But most importantly, you'll learn how to trust yourself again." The room fell quiet. Then one woman raised her hand. "How did you start?" she asked. I smiled. "With $289 and a bruised ego." They laughed and the sound echoed like sunlight through the room. By the second week, Quiet Haven had transformed into something between a school and a sanctuary. Women huddled by the fireplace comparing notes about investments. Others practiced budgeting in notebooks I'd designed myself. Helen, now the director of the foundation, oversaw logistics with her usual precision. Layla handled the online academy teaching our digital students across the country. And I taught mornings and walked the lake in the afternoons, watching the wind move across the water like a quiet applause. One evening after class ended, a young woman named Jessica approached me. She was 28, a single mother from Texas who'd joined our scholarship program. "I wanted to thank you," she said, holding back tears. "I bought my first share last week. It's small, but it's mine." I smiled. That's how empires start, one small claim at a time. The next morning, Jessica posted her story online, a photo of her holding her stock certificate beside a sign that read, "Quiet Haven Graduate." It went viral overnight. Thousands of comments flooded in from women saying, "If she can, I can." That week we realized the viral attention needed a structured output, and the Quiet Haven Foundation was officially born. Soon after, a producer from a national TV network called. They wanted to feature Quiet Haven in a series called American Renewal. I hesitated at first, afraid of the noise, the exposure. But Helen said, "You've been hiding long enough. Let them see what peace really looks like." The day of filming, the air shimmered with sunlight. The crew followed me through the resort, filming the cabins, the gardens, the classroom. The interviewer asked Rachel, "When your father said you were too poor for Christmas, did you ever imagine this?" I smiled softly. "No, but I imagined something better. Not wealth, freedom." When the episode aired, Quiet Haven exploded again. Bookings tripled, donations to the foundation poured in, and my inbox filled with messages from women around the world. One email stood out. It was from my father. I saw the broadcast, he wrote. "You've built something remarkable. I'm proud of you. I hope you can forgive me for not seeing you sooner." For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I read his words. Just peace. I didn't reply not because I didn't care, but because I no longer needed to explain myself. Silence, I'd learned, was its own form of closure. That weekend, we hosted Quiet Haven's first legacy retreat, a gathering of alumni from our programs. They came bearing stories, not gifts. One had started a small real estate business, another had paid off debt, one had bought a piece of land to build her own cabin. We lit a fire by the lake that evening. As the stars came out, I stood in the circle of women faces glowing in the firelight and said, "Legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's who we lift up while we're still here." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then someone began to clap. Soon everyone joined in soft. At first, then louder, until the sound rolled across the lake like thunder. After everyone went to bed, I stayed by the fire alone with the crackling wood and the cool night air. The lake reflected the stars perfectly, as if the sky had bent down to admire itself. Helen came to sit beside me, her gray hair catching the light. "So," she said, "what's next for you, boss?" I smiled. "I'm not the boss anymore." "We are. Are you thinking about expanding again?" "Maybe," I said. "Colorado, Oregon, maybe Arizona. Places where quiet still lives." She chuckled. "You're going to turn silence into an empire." "Not an empire," I said softly. "A ripple." The next morning, I wrote a new page in Grandma's notebook. Legacy isn't built on land or money. It's built on the moments we choose peace instead of pride. That afternoon, I stood on the deck overlooking the lake. A group of women laughed below, their voices rising like music. Somewhere a wind chime rang. I could almost hear Grandma's voice in it. "Keep building, Rachel. Quiet is stronger than noise." As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I felt that familiar peace settle deep inside me. The kind that didn't come from winning, but from knowing I'd already built something no one could own, something that would outlast the noise. Before heading back inside, I turned once more to the lake and whispered, "This is for all the women who were told they were too poor for Christmas. Look at us now." The water rippled in answer, golden in the dying light. Quiet Haven didn't just survive. It sang. 2 years after that Christmas, I stood on the same land that once broke me and watched the sunrise ignite the lake surface in a wash of brilliant light. The air was sharp, clean, full of promise. Quiet Haven had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. 8 cabins now, a greenhouse, a studio for workshops, and a new space we called the Learning Lodge. That morning, we were filming a video for the foundation's 2nd anniversary. The crew wanted a single shot of me walking along the dock at dawn, a symbol of how far the project had come. But as the cameras rolled, I wasn't thinking about the lens. I was thinking about the first night I'd slept here, when this place was nothing but a patch of dirt and defiance. When the director called cut, Helen handed me a mug of coffee. "Are you ready for your speech, boss?" she asked. "I don't think I'll ever be ready," I said, smiling. "But let's do it anyway." Inside the lodge, 50 women sat waiting, graduates, new students, mentors. Behind them, the walls were covered in photos from the early days, me with a hammer. Helen hauling wood, the first cabin, standing crooked but proud. I stepped up to the podium. Quiet Haven started as a single cabin built from silence, I said. But what it became is something much louder, a reminder that peace can build power if you give it purpose. Applause filled the room. I looked around and saw Jessica sitting in the front row, now teaching her own real estate for beginners course. She winked at me. After the ceremony, we cut the ribbon for the new Quiet Empire Academy, an online learning platform teaching women about stock-share, gold, crypto, and real estate. It had been Layla's idea, and now it has reached more than 10,000 members worldwide. As the press interviewed guests, I stepped outside for a moment of air. The sun was high now, glinting off the lake. I thought about my father. We hadn't spoken since his last letter. Part of me still wished he could see this, not to gloat, but to understand. As if the universe was listening, my phone buzzed. His name flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Rachel," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "I saw the news. The expansion. It's impressive." "Thank you," I said carefully. I just wanted to say I was wrong. About everything. Silence stretched between us. He exhaled. Your grandmother would have been proud. My throat tightened. She taught us both something. You just forgot it sooner. He laughed softly. Maybe I did. I'm proud of you, Rachel. Truly. Thank you, Dad, I said, meaning it. Take care of yourself. When I hung up, I didn't cry. I just stood there, the wind cool against my face, and let the moment settle. Forgiveness didn't come as a rush, it came as stillness. Later that week, the foundation hosted a live stream event celebrating our milestone. I stood on the deck, a microphone clipped to my sweater cameras surrounding me. The chat on the screen overflowed with hearts and comments from women around the world. I looked into the lens and said, 2 years ago, I was told I was too poor for Christmas. Too small to matter. Too late to start over. But peace doesn't need permission. It just needs persistence. I paused, feeling the emotion rise but not break. Quiet Haven isn't just a place anymore. It's proof that you can build an empire from the very thing they said made you weak. The comments exploded goosebumps. This is my sign to start. Thank you for reminding us that silence can roar. When the live stream ended, Helen hugged me tightly. You did it, she whispered. No, I said, we did. That night, after everyone left, I walked down to the dock alone. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and for a moment I could almost see my grandmother standing at the edge, smiling. I whispered, I built it, Grandma. But you planted it. I sat there for a while, listening to the soft ripple of the water. The air smelled of pine and smoke from the distant fire pits. Somewhere, laughter echoed from the cabins. Quiet Haven wasn't quiet anymore, not the way it used to be. It was alive, filled with stories, second chances, and the hum of peace being earned. Before going inside, I wrote one last entry in Grandma's notebook. Once I built Quiet Haven to escape the world. Now I build to welcome it. A week later, Forbes Women ran another feature titled Quiet Empire: How Rachel Moore Turned Peace into Power. The article described how we'd launched a scholarship program for women in developing countries and opened a second property in Colorado. When I read it, I didn't feel pride. I felt gratitude. Every mistake, every humiliation, every too poor had led here to this. The next morning, I hosted a sunrise class for our new members. As the golden light spread across the mountains, I told them, this isn't about success. It's about sovereignty. You don't need permission to build peace. You just need a plan. They nodded, some taking notes, others just watching the lake like it was a mirror of their future. When the session ended, I lingered a little longer. The air was cool, the world quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves. I took a deep breath, smiled, and whispered to no one in particular, if peace had a sound, it would be this. I turned toward the cabins, glowing in the early light. Quiet Haven stood like a promise carved into the earth, steady, unshakable, alive. Once I'd built it to prove them wrong. Now I built so others could remember what right felt like. The empire wasn't loud. It didn't glitter. It breathed. And every breath of it whispered the same truth. Peace was never the absence of noise. It was the courage to build anyway. If this story reminded you of your own, leave a comment. Tell me what you're building, even if it's just hope. And if you're still searching for your quiet haven, stay with us. We're just getting started.